Good afternoon, everybody. Again, it's Thursday, August 15th, 2024. It's approximately 1:30 p.m. We are resuming Public Service Commission case number 9738, which is captioned the application of Southern Maryland Electric Cooperative, Inc. For adjustments to its retail rates and charges for electric distribution service and other tariff revisions. We are resuming the staff witness testimony of David Valcarengi, and I believe we were in the middle of cross-examination by the company.
Yes, thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Valcarengi, prior this morning, you and I had talked about whether SMECO had ever experienced an operating loss from its distribution operations, and we had talked about that. You recall that there may have been a data request response?
I recall that.
Yes. Your Honor, may I approach?
Please. Yeah, I'm going to need you to get a little closer to the microphone. The court reporter can't hear you.
Thank you.
Your Honor, I could ask that if we could please have SMECO response to staff data request number 29, item number 29-5, marked as SMECO Exhibit 23 for identification.
So marked.
So, Mr. Valcarengi, have you had an opportunity to just take a quick look at this response?
I have.
And our discussion that we had earlier today, this morning, about losses and the fact that there was information provided through discovery. Is this the discovery response that that you remembered? That
Yes, and this refreshes my memory that SMECO incurred a loss, but as I indicated previously, the non-operating margins produced an operating margin, like I said before.
Your Honor, SMECO moves to have 29 exhibit number 23, the response to 29-5, included and admitted into the record.
Is there any objection?
No objection from staff, Your Honor.
No objection from OPC, Your Honor.
Staff data response, or SMECO's response to staff data request 29-5 will be marked and entered into the record as SMECO's Exhibit 23.
Mr. Valcarengi, you still have your direct testimony
I do.
in front of you. Could you please turn to page 12 of your direct testimony?
I'm there.
I'm specifically referring to table 4.
Okay.
And you reproduce this table in your rebuttal testimony as well. Is that true?
It is in my rebuttal.
And
I think it's, do you want a specific location? It's table 4 on page 6 of my rebuttal.
okay. And it's the exact same table. The figures and the numbers haven't changed. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, you have, I would like to refer to the top row on this chart, and you've identified that as non-fuel. Is that correct?
Yes.
And non-fuel isn't like a term or an item that you pulled from SMECO's financial statements. Is that correct?
It should be your O&M less purchase gas cost.
Okay, that's, you've helped us along there. So non-fuel, you take out the purchase power, and this is just represents O&M. Is this figure inclusive of transmission-related O&M?
If they were in SMECO's financials, then yes.
And so you did not make any adjustment here to pull out of these figures any costs associated with SMECO's transmission revenue requirement.
There would be no way for me to do that other than an estimated basis. I had to reflect it based on the information I had at the time.
Okay. And, okay, so this is a gross amount for both distribution and transmission, correct?
Well, this represents a tally of the components as laid out in SMECO's financials.
And this also is this spending include spending related to reliability projects? Is that included here as part of the O&M in your understanding?
The short answer is I would say I don't know. All this schedule, it simply takes SMECO's numbers and reflects them. But reliability is oftentimes a capital item. Now, there can be O&M associated with reliability, but oftentimes it is largely a capital component.
Let's, for example, vegetation management. That's a reliability-related expense. That's O&M, correct?
Yes.
And that would be inclusive. And reliability work such as vegetation management, that's all included in this pot of dollars that is identified on that row as non-fuel. Is that correct?
If they are reflected within SMECO's numbers, then they're reflected in my numbers as well that are embedded in this chart.
Okay. Now, this is the adjustment that you are putting together, that you've put together as, and I think you've called it it's a proxy. Is that correct?
Yes, I did call it a proxy.
Okay. And this is you, and just looking at your testimony on line 3, you're saying that this is a proxy for removing unwarranted costs incurred between 2022 and 2023, correct?
That's what it says.
Yes. And you specifically have not identified here or in any data request responses what unwarranted costs you are referring to.
Right, but it's also, as we touched upon earlier, as you build a revenue requirement, you're using a test year. And if that test year reflects an abnormality, it needs to be mitigated in some fashion. That is what's happening here.
So you're starting off with the assumption that there is an abnormality and you're creating a proxy to remove costs that support the assumption.
Well, we know it's abnormal. The fact that SMECO experienced an operating loss within 2023, it's never experienced that kind of condition before. That in and of itself creates an abnormality that needs to be corrected.
And the costs that this proxy that you've developed are costs that you feel that are going to be captured are unusual, extraordinary, or otherwise non-recurring. Is that correct?
I think that's a fair statement because something within SMECO's cost caused an abnormal level of operating margins within the period. So I think it's incumbent to mitigate that as best possible.
And the proxy that you've developed here on page 13 of your direct testimony is designed to address costs to the extent that they exist, that are unusual, extraordinary, or otherwise non-recurring. Is that true?
Yes.
You see, farther down in your response, you discuss, beginning on line 11, you said, I will revisit this adjustment if additional information causes me to reconsider, to reevaluate my position. Do you see that?
Where are you at, Counselor?
Beginning at line 11, ending on line 12, there's a sentence that reads, I will revisit this adjustment if additional information causes me to reconsider, to reevaluate.
Line 11. I see it. I see it.
See that? Okay. We had, you filed this testimony on July 3rd, is that correct?
Yes.
And we had been discussing earlier this morning SMECO Exhibit 10, I believe, which is the responses to Staff Exhibit 48. Do you recall that discussion?
Yes.
And among the requests that are included in SMECO Exhibit 10 and the requests, it included requests and responses to requests that talked about identifying various cost levels and the differences that existed between 2022 and 2023. Is that correct?
Yes, that's accurate. But as I indicated earlier, that gives you what I would call the A to B. It doesn't give you the driver of what's provoking the loss or the increase in cost.
But if I recall your testimony from this morning, you said that you didn't engage in an in-depth look at the responses to 48. So are you to be able to form any conclusion regarding whether or not this provides more than just a to B comparison? Isn't that true?
I'm not sure I understand.
Well, I'll break it down into, we talked about it this morning, and you said that you have not taken a deep dive look into the responses to 48. Is that correct?
That's true.
Right. And right now you're testifying that the responses to 48 don't provide sufficient information to cause you to rethink your adjustment. Is that correct?
That's accurate.
Okay. And you know that 48 doesn't provide sufficient information to allow you to rethink your adjustment, despite the fact that you didn't do an analysis of the information.
Well, I think I would answer it this way. I can probably spend a couple hours going through 48-1, and I can get a roadmap as to cost, but you're still left with the underlying condition of an operating loss within that period. That's a condition that, in my opinion, needs to be corrected.
Mr. Valcrengi, I'd like to shift gears a little and talk about unbilled revenues. Did you have an opportunity to review Ms. Kennedy's testimony regarding unbilled revenues in both 2022 and 2023?
Yes.
Do you happen to have a copy of Ms. Kennedy's testimony with you?
Yes.
Okay, could I please direct your attention to Ms. Kennedy's rebuttal testimony?
Page?
Getting to it right now. Beginning on page 12 with the question on line 20 that says, please explain an unbilled revenue entry.
Well, see, well, go ahead and
there's-
ask your question.
Yeah, there's no question yet. So do you understand do you agree with Ms. Kennedy's explanation as to what an unbilled revenue entry is?
I fully understand what unbilled revenues are.
Okay, and do you agree with her description of what an unbilled revenue entry is?
Where does she,
It begins on page 12, line 20.
no, unbilled revenues are a standard accounting entry.
Right, and I recognize that, but my question was, do you agree that she has accurately described it here in her testimony?
I don't have any information in my possession that would refute the statement.
So, just so it's clear for the record, so with unbilled revenues, what we are discussing is that when SMECO ends up issuing bills at the conclusion of a calendar year in December 2022, those bills are issued, but the revenues associated with those bills are not yet collected from customers. Is that correct?
That's correct.
But with the way that SMECO's practices, and as you understand the practice, is that the actual revenues, though, are reflected in the month that they are billed. And so these revenues would be booked to, for example, in 2022, December 2022, the unbilled revenues for that month would be booked to 2022. Is that correct?
Yes, that's accurate.
And then when the revenues are actually received following customers paying their bills, there is a corresponding adjustment that needs to be made in 2023 to back those revenues out so there isn't effectively a double count. Is that correct?
That's true.
And prior to coming here today, like you see, you reviewed Ms. Kennedy's testimony regarding Winter Storm Elliott. And I can give you a reference. It's beginning on line 7 of page 13, where Ms. Kennedy describes that in 2022, Winter Storm Elliott, which occurred between December 23rd and 26th, resulted in a significant increase in SMECO's kilowatt-hour electricity sales as temperatures plummeted. Do you see that?
I do.
And you have no reason to refute or to disagree with Ms. Kennedy's statement. Is that correct?
No, in fact, I didn't take issue with it in my rebuttal testimony.
Okay. And you don't take issue with the figure, like the figure, if you go down to the next sentence where she talked about it increasing SMECO's 2022 margins by $9.2 million, the impact of Winter Storm Elliott. Do you see that?
I do.
And then when the reversal had to happen, there was a corresponding decrease to margins in 2023 that resulted from what you and I were just talking about, which is to avoid the double count, you had to back out those revenues that were associated with those higher kilowatt hour sales that occurred in December of 2022. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. would you agree, Mr. Valcarengi, subject to check, I don't, or maybe you know the numbers, that per SMECO's financial reports, the margins for 2022 that SMECO experienced were approximately $12.7 million?
They were in the range of 12 million in 2022.
Okay. And in 2023, the margins, would you agree, were approximately negative $2.3 million? Would you agree with?
Yes.
Now, also, I can do my lawyer math, but if we were to take the approximately $12 million, $12.7 million of margins in 2022, and we were to remove the impact of Winter Storm Elliott and the unbilled revenues, you would agree that the resulting number, and subject to check, would be approximately $3.5 million. If we were to take 12.7 million minus 9.2 million, simple math would get us to 3.5 million. Is that correct?
I would agree with that,
Okay.
the mathematics.
And similarly, if we were in 2023, if we were to take the negative $2.3 million of margins, and we were to account for the reduction in margins resulting from backing out those revenues associated with what occurred in December of 2022, that if we were to take the negative 2.3 million and then have reduced by, and then we have a negative $6.5 million adjustment, then that 2.3 to 6.5, you would agree that results in a positive $4.2 million?
The math sounds right.
Right. And so therefore, as far as 2022 and 2023 go, if we were to walk through an account for this unbilled revenue that occurred as a result of Winter Storm Elliott, then we're talking about a difference in margins that's 3.5 million versus 4.2 million. Those are the numbers that are derived from the math that we just went through. Is that correct?
Yeah, I understand the math, but I don't understand what significance that is.
I just want you to confirm that.
I agree to the mathematics.
Okay. You have before you, could you please reference SMECO Exhibit number 8, please?
I have it.
Okay. Could you please turn to what is the bottom of the page, 10 of the financial statement, which is attached to the response to staff data request 5, item number 5-15.
Are you in the item that says revenue recognition?
Yes, I just want you to confirm that what we have been discussing regarding unbilled revenues, that is something that is revealed and available in the financial statements at that note 2-L or 2.L. I'm sorry, did you respond?
I'm sorry, was I supposed to?
Oh, I was just saying, I just want you to confirm for me that the unbilled revenue that we were talking about just now in our discussion, that that issue is reflected here in note 2.L of the company's financial statements.
I would agree that the document reflects unbilled revenue numbers of 22.1 and 28.7 in 2.L.
Great, thank you. Mr. Belcringe, you would agree that, well, let me ask you this. Could you please explain for me the difference between an operating margin and a non-operating margin?
Those operating margins are those specifically related to, I guess I would call the distribution business. The non-operating ones are those that do not relate specifically to distribution related operations, but they in fact relate to SMECO as a whole.
Okay. So an example of something that would fall under the non-operating umbrella would be like Empower Maryland costs. Would that be correct?
Yes.
And you reviewed Ms. Kennedy's testimony where Ms. Kennedy made various adjustments to reflect the removal of non-operating margin, correct?
She made an adjustment to remove Empower Maryland, essentially the return component attached to those programs, and then life insurance proceeds.
Okay. Well, let's talk about the life insurance proceeds. You would agree, would you not, that the life insurance, well, isn't it true that the life insurance policy in question is a life insurance policy that was taken out with respect to a single individual, correct?
I think that's fair. I think, yes.
Yeah, this is not a company-wide policy where all employees have a similar type life insurance policy that is issued to them. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that was in the bench DR. I don't know where I remember seeing that it was allocated to one. I don't have any specific knowledge, but here it says the retired employee.
So it was a single, so your understanding is that there was a single employee that had a life insurance policy that was opened in his name, or to the benefit of a third-party beneficiary that was chosen by the employee, as well as to the benefit of SMECO.
I can't speak to that, but I don't have any reason to dispute that.
And you don't have any reason to dispute, do you, that the employee has, like that the employee in fact did retire and that the employee did in fact pass away?
I don't have any information to dispute those points.
But you would agree that insurance companies don't routinely provide distributions under a life insurance policy if the person who is identified in the policy is still living.
Objection, Your Honor.
Well, he said he.
What's the basis?
Why would he know about? I mean, he testifies assessment about operating costs and what are adjustments, but questions about what insurance companies do and don't do, I don't know how Mr. Vickeringy could know as an expert. That's all. Thank you.
I haven't reviewed the specific policy, but it would be atypical for an insurance company to make such a payout. But again, I haven't reviewed the specific policy in question.
And you don't have any information to refute the fact that similar life insurance proceeds will not be available during the period of time that the rates are in effect in this, growing out of this case.
But that's not the standard. What my point was that I wrote in my testimony is customers have paid for this, so arguably they should share in the proceeds that come from that.
And when the insurance policy proceeds are received, those monies do not go to other individuals or to shareholders, but in fact are used to help fund the operations of the company.
Is that a question? I'm not sure.
Do you agree with that statement?
Well, generally, if SMECO is a beneficiary of such policy, those proceeds would go back into the operating budget of the company.
And if I were to, and I believe you said you agreed earlier when we were talking about your proxy that you created, you talked about costs that were unwarranted, and then the unwarranted is a proxy for non-recurring costs not likely to recur again in future periods. Is that correct?
Yes.
Just one moment. I just would like to stay a little bit longer with the non-fuel adjustment that you were doing. You would agree
Are we
that
going back
because,
to the
page
direct?
13 again, in your direct, yes, thank you.
I'm there.
And so you would agree that this proxy that you've created, that it actually could have the effect of removing costs that are prudently incurred and known and measurable. Isn't that true?
Prudently incurred. The adjustment was designed, in my mind, to cure the operating loss or move in that direction. As I indicated before, I didn't say the costs were unreasonable and so forth. But my testimony is there's an operating loss, and if we don't do something to correct that, then rates are built upon that abnormal standard.
Mr. Valcarengi, we had talked earlier this morning as well about short-term debt and the short-term interest expense. Do you recall that discussion?
I do.
You would agree that that SMECO's obligation to pay short-term interest expense is something that is going to continue into the future. It doesn't have an end date.
I don't understand the question.
Well,
Are you asking me whether their responsibility
Like-
for short-term debt is ending?
Would you agree that SMECO's responsibility, based on your review of the short-term credit line balances, based on that you do expect that SMECO will continue to incur short-term interest expense moving forward into the future, that it's not going to sunset this coming December?
Well, are you asking, is this in relation to the adjustment that I prepared, or is this just
It's your general understanding of
that
SMECO's
doesn't go away
responsibility.
unless it's paid for? So to the extent that SMECO continues to use short-term debt, it's not an obligation that will go away.
Okay. And we also spent a little time this morning talking about depreciation. Do you recall that discussion?
I do.
Okay. And we had talked about the fact that as SMECO adds plant to service, and there's plant in service, that has an upward impact on costs that flow out of the depreciation expense. Is that correct?
Well, to the extent that you add plant, it necessarily will impact depreciation unless there is a change in depreciation rates, which would cause it to go down.
Right. But this is also an ongoing expense that SMECO, so long as SMECO continues to operate a distribution system and continues to invest capital in that distribution system, this is an ongoing expense that SMECO will
Yes,
have to the end of time.
I agree that both depreciation and interest are regular and continuing items of SMECO's business.
Mr. Valcarengi, you have spent time discussing with me, as well as putting in your testimony, the fact that you have routinely sought answers to questions regarding the difference between what happened in 2022 and 2023. Recall that?
I do.
Were you part of the telephone call that took place back on May 6th of this year, shortly after SMECO filed its rate case?
I don't know the specific date, but I remember it was generally it was a call to introduce your filing to us, and I recall that I broached that very topic of what provoked the loss.
And
And if you recall, I didn't get an answer then, and we still don't have a specific answer to event or events that transpired.
do you also recall during that same call that an offer was made that if there are any additional questions or any questions that you still feel you need more information, and this is true for all staff witnesses, and the same offer was made to OPC, that SMECO is willing to sit down and have a conversation and to discuss these questions and issues?
I don't remember that from that. I'm not saying it didn't happen, but I don't remember that from that specific call. My memory doesn't. I'm not reminded by. I'm not reminded of that overture.
And are you aware of the fact that there have been numerous offers made by SMECO to engage in discussions throughout the pendency of this case since its filing to answer any questions that any of the witnesses may have.
No, I am unaware. I am aware of an overture to me after I filed my surrebuttal testimony.
And is that something that you took the company up on to have that conversation?
At that point, it was.
Sorry. Oh, okay.
At that point, my testimony was already filed.
Are you aware of the fact that during the pendency of this case that there were other staff witnesses who in fact did take SMECO up on its offer to have discussions about anything that may be confusing?
My understanding is various colleagues from the staff have met with SMECO.
And we had been talking about SMECO Exhibit Number 10, which is staff's response to SMECO's response to staff data request number 48.
Yes.
And this is the data request that you refer to in your testimony at page 8, footnote 8. You don't identify it by number, you just state that there is.
Is this in the surrebuttal, sir?
It would be in the surrebuttal, yes.
Excuse me. Yes.
Could you please turn to the page 2 of 2?
In 48-1?
48-1, correct, yes. And you see here in this response, SMECO specifically states, in the event that staff believes there is something specific missing from the information, data, and explanations that have already been provided by SMECO to the parties that would help shed additional light on the financial challenges faced by SMECO and the impacts on 2022 and 2023 financial results and continuing today, please have counsel for staff contact counsel for SMECO to discuss, and the cooperative will endeavor to provide such additional information, data, and/or explanations to the extent available. Do you see that?
I do.
And did you take advantage of this offer to sit down with SMECO to get a better understanding of information that you feel that you did not receive?
I have not met with the company, no.
I want to go back, keep going back to your proxy calculation that you've come up with. Now, we talked a little bit about Ms. Bunch's testimony and the fact that she reviewed engineering information regarding SMECO's reliability spend. Is that correct?
I think that's a fair assessment.
Yeah, and she looked at both capital as well as O&M. Is that correct?
I believe that's accurate.
And it would be fair to say that within the dollars that are included on the prior page where you have your table, I believe it's table 4,
Table
row
4.
1 with the non-fuel, that the costs that Ms. Bunch reviewed and the information that she reviewed, that they would be subsumed within this non-fuel O&M bucket of cost.
It's accurate that reliability O&M would be reflected in what I have construed as non-fuel.
And you had mentioned also that one of the ways that to address like operating loss or increased cost is that you could find areas where you could cut costs. Is that correct? Is that a fair?
Well, I think it's always reasonable to go through strategies that seek to mitigate and reduce the cost to the extent possible.
Now, if I have reviewed your testimony carefully enough, I don't see that you, setting aside the rate-making treatment that you are recommending in this case, I don't see where you have identified any particular cost that you believe that SMECO will not incur on a going-forward basis. Is that correct?
I can't identify an element of a specific cost that won't be entertained in future periods, but that misses the kind of the grand scale picture of what it's attempting to do, and that is there's an operating loss within that period.
I want to touch again just briefly on inflation. You are recommending that there be no inflation adjustment. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And
for both 24 and 25.
Right, but you're not testifying that there will be no inflation. Is that correct?
No, I think my testimony states something to the effect of revenues either from existing customers or potential customers connected to the system will be sufficient to offset inflation as you've calculated it.
Okay, and I understand your testimony on that point, but that wasn't the question that I had asked you. I had asked you whether you believe that inflation will be at zero.
No, in fact, as we discussed earlier, I said inflation is ongoing. It will always be around. It will never be zero.
I want to talk about what you had just brought up regarding the offsets and the revenue offset that you feel will be sufficient to address the like the levels of inflation. When you rely on historical data to calculate what you believe will be an annualized level of revenues that SMECO will experience or could experience as a result of new customer additions. Is that correct?
I think I used let me see if I can find it. Are you talking about the chart that I developed, or the revenue?
Could you please refer to your rebuttal testimony at page 19?
I didn't do rebuttal testimony.
I'm sorry, sir, rebuttal. Actually, stepping back. Start again. direct testimony, page 19.
I'm there.
Okay. So here you have attempted to reflect additional revenue that SMECO is likely to receive based on new meters added to the system.
Yes.
And so what you've done, if I understand your discussion here, is you've gone to 2023 and you looked at historical numbers in 2023 regarding the number of new meters. Is that correct?
I used,
I can read what you wrote on the very first sentence if it makes it easier. SMECO added 2,171 residential meters and 92 commercial meters in 2023. Annualizing the meters installed in 2023 would produce $915,643 in additional revenues that should be realized.
I'm sorry, can you give me that again?
Page 19, line 4 through 6 is what I just read. And my question was that you used historical numbers from the test period from 2023 as a way to determine what the potential or likely revenues that SMECO might actually receive in future periods.
Yes.
2024 and 2025.
Yeah, I calculated revenue. I don't have, it was in the work papers, but I don't have it in front of me, so I can't speak to, it did start with 23, and it attempted to annualize the sales from those specific customers.
And on page 20, you conclude regarding the decision to not allow for any inflation adjustment, that based on the added revenue from new meters and the inability to gauge the limits of the predictability of cost pressures in future periods, you recommend SMECO's adjustments for inflation be rejected. Do you see that testimony?
I do.
But the added revenue that you are referring to here is not actual added revenue that SMECO will in fact achieve. Is that correct?
I don't understand that.
You aren't stating with certainty that the added revenue that you calculated on the page prior is actually the added revenue that SMECO will in fact achieve.
Well, I didn't choose to reflect that additional revenue within my revenue requirement. I simply suggested that the revenue is sufficient to offset your calculation for the impact on cost.
Yeah, but the revenue level that you use to compare against the inflationary costs are not revenues that you say will in fact be experienced by SMECO during the period that rates are in effect.
I guess we'll have to agree to disagree.
Well, let's look at your testimony, because your testimony, if I read it correctly, states that these are, and we can look at line 6.
What page?
Page 19, line 6. You say that these are potential new meters, not any certainty here,
Well,
and that are likely to be added.
just as the impact of inflation is potential.
Well, I'm just
Because we don't know that for certain.
I'm going to just ask the witness to wait till the question is finished.
You said that we should agree to disagree to my question that I stated, that the added revenue from new meters that you reference on page 20, line 16, that these revenues are the revenues that you've calculated, and I said that you're not testifying that these in fact will be achieved by the company, and you said...
Objection. I'm objecting. Counsel is testifying.
Overruled.
I can't state that with certainty, that these revenues will be realized by the company. Just as I can't state that the potential impact from inflation will be realized by the company as well. But I stated that these revenues are clearly in excess of the potential excess cost to be that the company is calculated as being impacted by inflation.
And in your discussion that's on page 19, where you talk about these additional revenues, I don't see a discussion about the costs or an analysis about the costs associated with hooking up these new meters.
I didn't hear a question. I apologize, Your Honor, but I still don't hear questions. I hear counsel replying to my
Is it in fact true that on page 19, where you discuss the amount of potential revenue that may be achieved by the company, there isn't any discussion regarding the costs associated with interconnecting these customers?
There is no discussion of cost to connect customers to the system.
But you would agree, would you not, that there is a cost associated with interconnecting customers to this system?
There can be, but there's a lot that goes into potential connection of a customer. I would have to go through a whole litany of analyses in order to make that leap.
But the cost is going to be, there will be, even the meter has a cost associated with it.
Yes, I would agree that a meter has a cost. It's not, the cost of a meter is less than, residential meter is less than $500, I believe.
And if there is a residential subdevelopment that is coming into SMECO service territory and that has 100 units and 100 new meters, there is the potential for a cost associated with upgrading the system and doing network upgrades in order to accommodate the greater load in that area. Isn't that true?
I would think that SMECO would estimate the potential investment associated with a development. And it's been a while since I looked at your extension tariff, but I would think that if there is a difference between that cost, then a contribution would be made by the developer in order to achieve parity.
One moment, Your Honor. I'm just checking to see if I may actually be finished or close to finished.
Thank you. Office of People's Counsel, cross-examination.
No questions, Your Honor.
Thank you. Department of the Navy.
No questions, Your Honor.
I have just a couple quick questions. respect to witness Kennedy's explanation, were you present during her testimony where she discussed, she answered my question regarding the short-term interest rate that's used to calculate monthly accruals for AFUDC? Did you hear her response?
Well, she said something to the effect of, when the construction balance is above the short-term debt, then they only use short-term debt.
Correct. When my notes reflect when the CWIP balance is lower value than outstanding balance,
That could be right.
they use the short-term debt. Does that change any of
No,
part
I
of
mean,
your recommendation?
that statement, I heard that statement, but it's functionally different than what SMECO expressed in discovery attached to my testimony. Let me see if I can't find it. No, I'm in the direct. Ms. Kennedy, in her rebuttal testimony, says they use both flavors, long-term and short-term debt. There isn't a qualification that once construction rises to a certain level, we only use short-term debt. If you trying to find,
I believe in your testimony, it's between page 9 and 10 of your SIR rebuttal. You
I'm trying to
discuss
find.
it.
Oh, here it is. The data request is 47-1 attached to my testimony. There is it goes through and it shows, it never does it say anything about if there is if our construction reaches a certain level, we're only going to use short-term debt. The first time I heard that announcement was when Ms. Kennedy was testifying last week. It's not in the notes. It's not in the discovery.
Do you agree or disagree with their use of?
It's unusual. Typically, a company is going to use all of their debt as a means of financing operations, construction, and so forth. And the reason I say that, attached, there's these screenshots that are attached in 47-1. The balance of debt is changing. Now, it's not changing by 100,000, 200,000, but the balance of long-term debt is changing on a month-to-month basis. And so I pair that with the statement that she said, and I can't. It just doesn't make any sense to me. And that's why I chose to use both the long-term and the short-term debt.
Have you had a chance to review SMECO's response to bench data request 3-1, which I believe is now entered into the record as PULJ Exhibit
Yes,
2?
I've seen this, 3-1.
Yes. Does that change your recommendation with respect to the adjustment for incentive compensation?
No. In my mind, this doesn't lay out a framework. This doesn't lay out a framework. This essentially is a job description, providing overall functions for that position. The other incentive plan has key performance indicators that provide an overarching metric, if you will. This is just a general statement. There's no roadmap as to what successes or failure was achieved.
Did you have a chance to review the bench data response 2-1, which is PULJ Exhibit 1? We're going back to the insurance proceeds. I believe your testimony was that the premiums that were included in customer member rates should be attributed to the benefit of the customers. That's correct?
That's my position.
So what would you propose to account for the premiums?
Well, the premiums were paid historically. What you're seeing here in this case is 1.1 million of proceeds from the life insurance contract. SMECO would say it is a non-recurring event. And my position is it relates to distribution operations because distribution paid for those contracts. And so it seems equitable to farm those dollars back into the calculus. Now, there is some, it wouldn't be inaccurate to amortize them over some period.
The premiums,
The proceeds.
the proceeds.
Because the data request says that there's 251,000 of premiums associated with the life insurance contract, and it paid out 1.1 million. And you can make the thing that 1.1 pays the 251, and then the difference you can amortize that over an appropriate period. But it raises the question of are you going to have a similar event? And that's one of the reasons why you would amortize it, kind of like what you do for rate case expenses.
Okay. I don't have any other questions. Is there a redirect from staff?
Yes, Your Honor, thank you. Mr. Valcarengi, is there any place in your direct or your rebuttal where you've stated that the adjustment related to 2023 loss was unreasonable or simply wrong?
I don't characterize it as such. In my mind, the adjustment is necessary in order to correct or mitigate an anomalous situation, i.e. the operating loss that transpired in 2023. Because if you don't correct that, then rates automatically reflect that anomalous result.
And can you just explain that the anomalous result?
The anomalous result is in 2022, SMECO realized operating margins of approximately 12 million, and then in 23 experienced a negative $2 million in 2023.
And Mr. Valcarengi, for rate making purpose, what's the danger? Or what's the issue there?
Well, typically when you're setting rates, you want to remove those items that are unusual, atypical. If you don't, then you're going to be reflecting that abnormal result in the rates that come out of this proceeding. In SMECO's case, their cases typically last for 2 to 3 years. So that anomalous result would be baked into the rates for a period of 2 to 3 years.
And Mr. Valcarengi, speaking of other SMECO cases, it was asked earlier, what SMECO cases did you testify in? But is it true or is it not true that in your position as the Deputy of Accounting Division that you review and are very involved in many of the cases, even if you don't actually testify in them?
That's true.
Mr. Valcarengi, a lot of questions were asked about the loss and your treatment of the loss. Would you characterize your treatment of it as conservative?
Yes.
And can you explain how or why?
It's conservative because if you heard and you review prior financial performance for the cooperative, it's generally in the neighborhood of $20 million. The adjustment that I propose does not get you anywhere near to $20 million. And that's why I call it a conservative adjustment.
Mr. Valcarengi, there were a lot of questions today about the loss, and there was a statement yesterday by witness Cox. I'm just going to ask if you heard the statement that the 2023 loss was due to state mandates related to electrification. Did you hear that statement?
Objection, Your Honor, goes beyond the scope of cross-examination. I never got into that.
Well,
Sustained.
I'd like to be heard on that. I don't want to take your time, but there have been extensive questions today by counsel relating to data requests, questions that weren't in any of Mr. Valcarengi's testimony, and those questions were allowed. This is a relevant question. That's what I'd like to say. There have been a lot of questions that were asked of Mr. Valcarengi that weren't in his testimonies today.
On cross-examination, and can you repeat your question?
Yes, happy to. And thank you for your indulgence, counsel, too. I'd like to know if Mr. Valcarengi heard witness Cox's statement that the loss was due in part to state mandates related to electrification.
And I would renew my objection because this is effectively rebutting Ms. Cox, who came yesterday, and I didn't get into that on cross-examination.
And I'm going to sustain the objection.
Mr. Valcarengi, there were some questions today about the artesian water case. Was that from 10 years ago? Do you recall?
Well, one has a date of April 2014, and the rebuttal has a date of October 27, 2014.
Was
So
that
yes,
pardon me, sir?
Approximately 10 years ago.
Mr. Valcarengi, was that case from another jurisdiction?
Yes, they were filed in the state of Delaware pursuant to Delaware Public Service Commission rules and regulations.
Mr. Valcarengi, do rate-making rules and principles vary by jurisdiction?
I mean, each state is going to have their own guidelines, rules, procedures for developing rates. The end result should be the same, just and reasonable rates.
Mr. Valcarengi, there was a question earlier today about the concept of known and measurable. Can you explain how you understand that and apply that, how you apply that in this case?
Known and measurable would be things that you're able to deduce readily. You're able to quantify all aspects of it, and you're able to measure the impact of that, of those elements, and reflect it within, your package, your revenue requirement.
And Mr. Valcarengi, in this case, in some of the information that was provided, how was that achieved or not?
I'm not sure I'm following your question.
Did you receive information? Did you receive information that wasn't known and measurable? Did you see forecasted information?
Well, is your question in regard to SMECO's inflation adjustment?
The adjustments that go into 2025, sir.
Yeah, in my opinion, attempting to reflect potential increases 12 months beyond the test year is just inappropriate.
And why is that, Mr. Valcarengi?
Because it's the reason why you use a test year to begin with. You're using the test year as a building block for developing rates for service. Things that are 12 months past greatly impact or change the dynamic of what happened within the test year. And that's why you don't selectively pick items that are that far beyond the test year, because it distorts and misaligns the test year. It's one thing if you are doing a forecasted test year where you're taking rate base and revenues and expenses, and you're reflecting them within, say, 25, 26, or 27. To selectively go out multiple periods out, I think is just inappropriate.
Mr. Valcarengi, do you still have in front of you SMECO 13, sir?
I do.
Mr. Valcarengi, the question 2-6, the response from the company that was discussed a little while ago, and then the following page. Well, just the first part. How did that not answer the question? How did the response not answer your question?
Well, to me, this gives an extremely high level analysis without a quantification of cost between periods. You can't look at this chart and say it's impacting the bottom line by $3 million, $4 million. All you're seeing is various increases, but you can't quantify how these items are impacting the bottom line. And these increases are over 2020 to 2024.
And you were also asked about the company's response to staff data request 2-10, which is on the third page of SMECO 13. I think you're holding on to that. Could you read the response to staff's question, and could you explain how that also was not responsive?
Please indicate specifically the principal causes leading to the distribution loss of $8.5 million for the year ending December 23, as discussed on page 16. Is the loss due to increases in capital spending, operating costs, or a combination of these elements? Explain in detail. Response, see item 2-6, which highlights the chart that we were just talking about.
And did it help provide any clarity?
No, none whatsoever.
And Mr. Valcarengi, in that same exhibit, SMECO 13, sir, staff data request number 5-3. Could I ask you to go to that page, sir?
How far? I got it.
Excuse me.
yeah.
What's the reference again? I'm sorry.
Sure, no. 5-3, I'm in SMECO 13, which starts with, yeah, okay. SMECO 13, I'm now at item 5-3. Mr. Valcarengi, could I ask you to read the question, the staff's question, number 5-3, sir?
Item 5-3, please indicate the balance of short-term debt at the end of December 22, 23, and the most recent balance in 2024. How much of the short-term debt on the balance sheet is applicable to distribution operations?
And how would you characterize the response, sir?
How would I characterize
Did this response help explain the loss, Mr. Valcarengi?
Well, the company provided the information as requested. It's 48 million of short-term credit at the end of 22. And then it shows the increase in utilization through 23 and into 24.
But does the response help explain the loss, or the drivers of the loss?
No.
Mr. Valcarengi, could I ask you to look at the response, still in SMECO 13, 5-6. May I ask you to read the question? Read 5-6, sir.
Please provide a copy of SMECO's 2023 annual financial report with the Commission. Please also provide a copy of SMECO's 2023 annual report that SMECO provided to its members.
Can you explain to me the significance of the response?
I'm not sure I'm following you. I mean, SMECO provides, attached is SMECO's I guess I would call it their corporate annual report that they provided to their members.
And was that useful to you in your analysis, sir?
The member report?
Yes, sir.
I mean, I glanced at it. I think I relied on SMECO's financials more than this member report.
Mr. Valcarengi, you were asked about the auditor's report, and it's 5-15. I'm not sure which SMECO exhibit is. If you give me a second, I probably can figure it out.
Here in 13.
Oh, it's SMECO 8. Sorry. Yes, sir. Their response to staff data request 515, which I believe is labeled SMECO 8. I'm going to pull it out.
Okay.
What was useful in the independent auditor's report?
I mean, the auditor's report simply confirms that which we've seen in the financial statements. You're getting a third party review of the financial statements. So you get a little clarity, you get confirmation, you get verification that the information is accurate as presented.
Mr. Valcarengi, you were asked some questions about the 2.3 million loss, 6.5 million, which would be attributable to, I think, Elliott.
Unbilled revenues, I believe it was.
Yes, sir. Pardon me. And you were asked to verify those numbers. What can we get from that? Is there anything that we can get from that that's useful for evaluating this case?
No, unbilled revenues are a standard item that appear in the financial statements. It was rather curious that the issue of unbilled revenues came up it wasn't until the rebuttal stage that the unbilled revenues came up as a cause of the decline in performance. I had been asking questions for, I don't know, since the beginning of May, and it wasn't until the rebuttal testimony arrived that suddenly unbilled revenues are a component cause of the misfortune.
And Mr. Valcarengi, you were asked if you knew the difference between, if I didn't characterize the question correctly, please correct me, counsel, but you were asked a question about operating margins versus non-operating margins. What's the significance to that here, sir? Is there any?
Well, ordinarily, no. In this case, you have operating margins and you have non-operating margins. The operating ones are those that relate specifically to what I would call distribution operations. In this case, there are two components, Empower Maryland and life insurance proceeds, that SMECO wants to remove out of the non-operating bucket, because those items, if you look at revenue minus expense creates operating margins, those items push up the operating margin, if that makes sense. SMECO is seeking to remove the Empower Maryland and the life insurance proceeds. My opinion, I think removing the life insurance proceeds is inappropriate because the customers have previously been responsible for paying those what I call it, the premiums associated with the contract.
Mr. Valcarengi, I'm sorry, but can I ask you to explain your answer about the question about witness Bunch's testimony and how that impacts this case, sir?
Your Honor, could I just ask for more clarification as to which question
Sure.
about Ms. Bunch's testimony?
Yeah, I'm sorry. There was a question, I think about in the past hour. I wrote down that counsel asked about Bunch's testimony about the dollars in Table 4. A way to address loss or increase costs. And I'm not sure what, I think that counsel's question went on a little bit about I think counsel's question was about rate making and about why those costs wouldn't. I think that's what the question was, sir. Your question, counsel. And I'm sorry if I don't have it exactly right. And that's what I wanted. I wanted Mr. Valcarengi to try to explain his answer. I think that the question was that it was a non-fuel cost.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Okay. Mr. Valcarengi, can I ask you to talk about, I think this may have been what counsel was talking about. There's a statement in your surrebuttal testimony addressing Ms. Bunch's testimony.
Honor, I object. I didn't refer Mr. Valcarengi to any point in his surrebuttal testimony about Mrs. Bunch's testimony. So
Okay.
it's outside the scope of cross.
Well, then it was in the direct. I'll look for it right now. Thank you. Mr. Valcarengi, I'd like to ask you a different question while I'm still looking for the other. But can I ask you to go back to SMECO 10? And Council asked you earlier about the company's response to staff data request 48-4. And it's about, I think it's about 3/4 of the way through the packet.
Are you pointing me at a specific location in here?
Well, it's, I wanted to direct, I have a question about it to ask you, and I wanted you to go to 48-4, the question and the answer, and that's in SMECO 10. And it's not numbered, but I can feel it. It's toward the back. It feels like it's
A little more than halfway through.
a little more than halfway through. Yes, ma'am.
I'm at 48-4.
Okay. Mr. Valcarengi, could you read the question, sir?
Item 48-4.
Yes, sir.
On page 11, line 6, SMECO indicates contractor and consulting costs have increased 27% since 2020. Please identify specific services and costs that changed between 2022 and 2023.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Valcarengi. Mr. Valcarengi, can you look at the company's response and tell me to what extent did their response answer that question, sir?
Well, I think in their mind it answered the question, but it wasn't helpful for me because although I can look at a document and I can earmark component increases, I can't look at this and see like directional boring single phase between 2020 and 2024. I have no idea by looking at this specific increase. Is that $10 million? Is it $2 million? There's really no way to know looking at that percentage increase. And also by looking at the percentage increase, you can't tell how much of that increase, I assume that that's an average increase over that 2020 to 2024 period.
Mr. Valcarengi, could I ask you to go to 48-6 in that same packet, just a few pages forward? Mr. Valcarengi, could I ask you to read staff's question, 48-6?
Item number 48-6, regarding page 11, lines 17 to 24, Ms. Kennedy describes changes in labor compensation that have occurred over the period 2021 to 2023. Please provide specific cost impacts of labor and labor-related compensation between 2022 and 2023.
Thank you, Mr. Valcarengi. And could you review the response and tell me to what extent did it answer the question, sir?
I think it does answer the question because you're getting labor components, BU and non-BU and part-time employees, and you get a scaled multi-year layout of SMECO's employment costs.
Thank you, Your Honor. I'm looking for one more question. I apologize for the delay. Mr. Valcarengi, there was a question a little while ago about your direct testimony on page 5. Well, actually, no, I don't know if it was page 5. I wrote a note in page 5. So the question earlier was about 2015 and about what happened in 2015. Mr. Valcarengi, to the extent that you know, what's the difference between what happened in 2015 for SMECO and the test year 2023?
As I understand it, I think it's the opposite is happening in this case than what transpired in 2015. And by that I mean, wait, scratch that. I think I misspoke. In 2015, there were operating margins. SMECO incurred an operating loss of 8.5, but that was reduced down to -3 once you reflect non-operating margins during that particular year in 2023. In what was it? In the 2015 case, I think that was a discovery item that
I believe it's item SMECO exhibit number 23.
I thought I had that. 23.
It's
It was
staff
a
data
single-
request 29-5 response.
No, I don't have it anymore. If I did have it.
I think they handed it out.
No,
They
did.
handed
I
it out
remember.
today. It wasn't in the big packets the other
No,
day.
I know.
May I approach the witness with my copy? Thank you.
So in 2015, according to their response to 29-5, they experienced an operating loss of 11.2 in 2015, but non-operating margins created were able to produce positive operating margins during that period. In this case, you have $8.5 million loss from distribution operations in 2023, but the non-operating margins weren't sufficient to produce positive operating margins in 23.
So is it an apples to oranges comparison, sir? Or are there similarities? Or what inferences can we draw, or would you draw, or are there none?
They're both operating periods, and SMECO operated within that period. Other than that, it is what it is.
Thank you, Your Honor. That concludes our questions. Thank you.
includes witness testimony. Briefs are scheduled for August 30th, 2024, according to the procedural schedule. For initial briefs with reply briefs due September 9th, 2024. Are there any other outstanding issues that we have to address before?
I have one small one, Your Honor. Earlier today, and I apologize for not being clear, staff's response to bench data request 1 was admitted into evidence as staff 14, I think. Staff 14, but I didn't make clear that it's staff's response to BDR 1-1 through 1-6 and the attachment, ma'am.
Okay.
And we just request that in its
That was-
entirety.
it was my understanding to include
Oh,
all
well,
of
thank
it,
you.
so for the record, so it's clear, 1 through 1 through 1 through 6 will be included in Exhibit 14. All right, is there any other issues that we need to address? Okay, well, thank you very much. We can go off the record.